Hello everyone, History with Hilbert here, and today I decided to make this video because, well, I've been cleaning through all of my stuff. I've been getting rid of quite a lot of it, and while I was going through, I found this little booklet that I picked up in Ireland, because I was in Ireland over the summer, I think 3 years ago now, and I visited a place there called Caherconnel, which was in County Clare, which is on the west coast of Ireland. And Caherconnel was basically this old, it dated back to the first finds that they found there were from the Bronze Age, but it was first inhabited from, say, the 10th century, and it was inhabited right the way up into about the 16th century. And Caherconnel was basically, it's a Cashel, and Cashel isn't just me saying castle with a very bad lisp. It's actually the anglicised version of an Irish word, which was then an Irish version of the English word castle, so it does eventually come back to castle. And essentially it was just this fort, and it was a ring fort, and we get a lot of ring forts in Ireland at the time, and as you can tell from the name, it's basically just a fort which was a ring, so a ring of stones in this case. In Caherconnel, the name, what it meant was, a caher is an Irish word for a sort of fort, for a ring fort. And Connell comes from the name Connell, which is an Irish name, because they believed that this ring fort, Caherconnel, was named after the Connell tribe. And a fun fact about the Connell tribe, or clan you might describe them as, is that the famous Irish king Brian Boru was also of this clan, and he came from somewhere close to this region, and they think that actually perhaps it was his cousin who founded Caherconnel in the 10th century or the 11th century, or rather he didn't found it, but he lived there. And the reason I'm making this video, as I said, is because I found this booklet as I was clearing through my stuff, and it's a bit random, but I have been uploading videos to a series called the Anglo-Saxon History Visualised, which I upload every Sunday. But I wanted to talk a little bit about Ireland in this period, because I've talked a lot about England during the period of the Dark Ages, or I know some people don't like the term Dark Ages, so the early medieval era, but I haven't really talked about Ireland. And Irish history is very interesting, because Irish history is in many ways a lot like British history, so mainland Britain, but it's also different. Irish history has always had one foot sort of firmly in the Gaelic past, and then you've got the English coming in with the Normans, with the strongbow in the 12th century, and obviously with the whole English Pale around Dublin. You've got, before that even, you've got the Norse influence in Dublin. You've got the arrival of Christianity before that. Obviously the Romans never come to Ireland, so they never have this civilizing thing. So Irish history is quite different in many ways to British history, although there are obviously similarities there, which makes it very interesting. And that's why I decided to make this video today about Caherconnel, which, as I said, I visited quite a while ago while I was in Ireland on holiday. Although there is evidence of earlier inhabitants around the region, it's found in, as I said, County Clare, and in a region called the Burren, which is a very old region. You've got a lot of old places there, so prehistoric places. Dolmen is what they're called, and you have lots of them sprinkled around. And it's the same at Caherconnel. It's literally a stone's throw away from another structure. I think it's a Bronze Age burial mound sort of thing that they have there. But this ring fort, this Cashel, or Caher if you want to use the Irish, this was built in the 10th century, and as I was saying, it was likely built by someone in Brian Boru, the famous king's family. Now, first of all, we'd have to ask, why did they build this structure when they did? And one answer for it that came to my head when I was thinking about this date, which is the early 10th century, is the coming of the Norsemen. And in Ireland they would have been Norsemen. It was the Norwegians who came to Ireland, and this is an interesting difference to, say, Britain, because on mainland Britain, especially in the east, with the English, it's the Danes. You have Danegeld, you have the Danelaw, so it's the Danish who come there. But with Scotland, the Western Isles, and Ireland, you have the Norwegians who come. So there's an interesting difference. And the first of these, this interaction with the Norsemen was with these short-term raids. So in AD 793 we have the first raid in England on the island of Lindisfarne. But we actually think now, or some scholars believe, that it's the same band of Norsemen who attacked Lindisfarne, who went back to Orkney, that they used Orkney as a base from which to attack other places. And that the following year, I believe, they attacked the Isle of Skye, which is in Scotland on the west coast, and that they also then attacked Iona, where there was a Celtic monastery in this time. And the year after that, so AD 795, we see the first Viking raid on Ireland, which was at Rathlin Island, which is now obviously off the coast of Northern Ireland today. And just like with the Danes in England, eventually these Viking raiders, they will no longer just be happy with raiding, and they eventually come and settle. And they do this in several places in Ireland. And another difference with the Norse influence in Ireland is that unlike in England, they don't really conquer that much of Ireland. Now, I often tend to think that these Scandinavians, or these Vikings as some people call them, were very much OP, that they simply bowled over any army that came up against them. But in actual fact, this most likely isn't very true at all. And we have several instances where we have these Viking raiders, they arrive and they try and raid somewhere, and they are massacred by the local inhabitants because they are just that much tougher. And the Vikings, or later on the Norsemen when they come in as armies rather than raiders, had a very difficult time in Ireland. And, we actually know about this from several Irish annals, which write about how whole armies from these Irish kingdoms, which I should probably explain actually. There were a few kingdoms in Ireland at this time. You had, obviously in England, you had the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but the Anglo-Saxons never came to Ireland, or at least they didn't in this era. But the Irish, the Celtic Irish, they had several kingdoms, and I think there were four main ones. One was called Leinster, which is, I think, around Dublin. One was called Ulster, which is the northwest. Then you had Munster, which was somewhere in the south, and the other one, I should really, hold on, I'll look this up. Connaught was the one that I missed out, which was around the west coast, say the northwest and going down. And Ulster, which was where the O'Neill or Uineal came from, was sort of in the northeast, so where today we have the country of Northern Ireland. And what I was saying was that there were several Irish kingdoms, and they would do battle against each other. And what's interesting about the Irish history and interaction with the Norsemen is that when they came, the Norsemen settled in several places. So Dublin is possibly the most famous one in Ireland. And it's interesting actually because Dublin is a Gaelic name. So you have Du, which I believe is black in Gaelic, and Linn, which meant pool, so it's like black pool. So I think that's going back to saying that the water around Dublin in the river called the Liffey, that river was particularly dark, and that's why it's called Blackpool, but that's just my meaning. Actually, Blackpool, that's a place in England. Oh, that's interesting. Anyway, but the Norsemen and the Irish, the Norsemen of one warlord would often side with one Irish king, and then they would fight against another kingdom. But oftentimes they would completely wipe each other out. So oftentimes you'd have that the Norsemen, their armies would be destroyed by these Irish clansmen. And they have a very tough time because in Ireland, these people had been fighting against each other in these kingdoms for hundreds of years, so the people were very much used to fighting in Ireland. And as well, you had lots of raiders and bandits, and that links me back nicely, eventually, back to Caherconnel, because I initially thought that it was built because of this raised threat of Norsemen. But actually, Caherconnel, County Clare, didn't really suffer that much under Norse Viking attacks or Norse settlement and colonization later on. As I said, Dublin was a famous Viking or Norse settlement in Ireland, as well as Limerick, which is then more on the west coast but below County Clare. But actually, it's much more likely that Caherconnel, the Cashel there, the Ringfort, was built to keep out ordinary raiders and enemy kingdoms and enemy war parties, because Ireland was very famous for the amount of raiders on the roads, and it was very inhospitable a lot of the time because of all of these raiders. So if you imagine now, we obviously have the police and things, and even in Anglo-Saxon England, I think raiders weren't half as much of a problem as they were in Ireland. So they think that they built this ring fort, which it really was just a ring of stones, and then they later added things. So in the 15th century, I think they built a gateway, and they built sort of ramparts. Well, not quite ramparts, but they made it easier to defend with, you know, the new muskets and things that were coming in at the time. But in its simplest form, it was simply just a ring of stones which they piled up. And we now think that this was done not to keep out the Norse in Ireland, but just to keep out the raiders, because there were so many of them. Another interesting thing about the inhabitants of the ring fort at Caherconnel is that they were sort of isolated from the outside world. They did obviously have contact with them. We think they would have traded a little bit, because we do find items that we believe were traded. But in many ways they remain very rooted to the past. And actually one of the reasons we think they built the ring fort on top of this site was because there were burials found. And I said there was a Bronze Age burial mound found. And, hey, that rhymes. And actually we see that there were these remains found, these bones of these people from the 7th century. And then we find that the place, there wasn't any real inhabitants from the 7th century. And then suddenly in the 10th century, we find this ring fort is being built on top of them. And in accordance with Irish tradition, Irish paganism, although they would have been Christian at this time, Christian in Ireland didn't really mean that much up until the Middle Ages, because, well, the tradition, the original tradition, the Celtic religion was very much entwined with Christianity at this time. So even if someone called themselves a Christian, they'd probably still be giving votive offerings to the spring, to the fertility goddess, and they'd still be saying mass. And in keeping with these older traditions, we then think that they built the ring fort on top of these remains as a way of then honouring these ancestors. And as I said, the people in the ring fort, they did remain sort of very true to their native roots in that sense. They built the ring fort on top of these ancestors. And also we don't find any pottery there. And you might think, well, we don't find any pottery, so what, they had Tupperware, who cares? But when you couple this with the fact that they also had very traditional ways of textile production and ironworking and grain processing, then we can start to see Caherconnel as maybe a model of a more traditional, a more native Irish settlement that didn't have all these influences that the later ones did. So essentially this could make Caherconnel like looking through a window into the past. And the fact that they didn't have pottery, and remember pottery a lot of the time, there's a very famous saying in genetics as well, and archaeology and anthropology, that pots aren't people. And what this essentially means is that pots aren't people, in that when you find a certain type of pot in, say, before the 1960s, then it was assumed that when you find a certain pot, it was attached to a certain people. So for example, you have a type of ceramics which is called the Anglo-Frisian ware of pottery. And they found this in Frisia, the region of, the Netherlands, Germany, the coastal region there. And they also found it in England and in Scandinavia. And then they said, whoa, the Frisians, they've taken their pots to England and Scandinavia. That means that the Frisians colonized England and Scandinavia. And this was taken as fact. Whereas now we think it's more like that, yes, they might have developed this type of pottery, but we know that the Frisians were the big traders in the North Sea, so they probably just passed on this culture, this skill of making this Anglo-Frisian ceramic ware, and passed it on. So in the same way, we often find that these pots, that rather than there being a whole different culture or ethnicity of people when you find this pot, it might just have been passed on as something that was learned. And from this we can then also see that Caherconnel, because there is no pottery, is then not saying that it's been, appropriated by another culture, that they're just passing on this other culture, that this is the native Irish way of living, or at least their native way. Maybe there were people there before, but we're not sure. But that makes Caherconnel quite an interesting one if you look at that. And Caherconnel, again, as I said, was founded by members of maybe a royal family who were then later related to Brian Boru, who is very famous for defeating the Norsemen at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014 AD, but there were people of influence who lived there. Alright everyone, I know this video has been incredibly all over the place and more so than usual, but I found this little booklet and I was inspired to make a video on this Tuesday night. As I say, I make the videos of Anglo-Saxon history visualized on Sunday, every Sunday, and I also upload a video every Thursday. And maybe if I'm in the mood once in a while, I'll upload a video maybe like this on Tuesday as well, if you're interested. So thanks very much for watching. I'll leave links and cards and things so that you can see other videos that are related to topics here. And I hope you've enjoyed this video. It's been a bit of a different style, a bit more laid back. I haven't really made any notes or decided what I was going to talk about this, I've just gone for it, a bit more of a ramble, but I hope you have enjoyed it. Alright everyone, thanks very much for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm History with Hilbert, and I'll see you again soon.